Okay, everybody's welcome. This is an unusually timed event because it's an unusually timed event in the sense that we don't usually, we don't often have kind of breaking news type investigative journalism speakers. So, I'm excited. So this is SCL and Cambridge Analytica peering inside the propaganda machine with Emma Briant, who is a senior. Well, right now you're a visiting researcher at our center, which is how we, why this. We're privileged to have this event taking place with us, and not in some, I don't know, more breaking newsy, a Cambridge Analytica-y place. Although there is a sort of, a significant crossover with issues of Islamophobia and kind of playing off anti-Muslim stereotypes. So I think there's a significant subject matter overlap. So Emma Briant is senior lecturer, which, this is actually very helpful, equivalent of associate professor in the United States. She's at the journalism at University of Essex, and she specializes in researching and publishing on the topics of propaganda, international security, media debates of politics, inequality, and human rights. Dr. Briant analyzed the coordination and increasing impacts of the digitalization of defense propaganda for her book Propaganda and Counterterrorism, which came out in 2015. As part of this, she spent 11 years researching the SCL Group, which I assume is the parent company of Cambridge Analytica. Parent company of the controversial contract to Cambridge Analytica. She is currently visiting scholar at George Washington University and Georgetown University. Is that allowed?
Apparently.
I don't know. There's a kind of a rivalry between our schools. As she writes forthcoming co-authored book with Professor Robert Entman. The book is titled "What's Wrong with Democrats, Media Bias, Inequality, and the Rise of Donald Trump." For research on propaganda, U.S. politics, and Brexit, she gained unparalleled access to interviews with senior executives at Cambridge Analytica. I've heard some of this material, which is fascinating. This formed the basis for important evidence submitted to the UK Digital Culture, Media and Sports Committee inquiry into fake news in April 2018. It's a parliamentary inquiry.
Yes.
Among other public inquiries. So, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. That's a really lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'm really honored to be here as a visiting scholar at ACMCU, as well as the British Initiative, and just in this really great country for the summer, working on my new book. It's really lovely that you've all come. It's really quite well attended. I'm very, very grateful to you all to be here. Basically I'll give you a little bit about my background to start off with, because I think it's one of the things that people keep asking me about is like how on earth I got to be in this position. My PhD, I studied for my doctorate at Glasgow University in Scotland, and that was looking at Anglo-American relations and propaganda during the War on Terror. And that essentially formed the basis of my book, my second book actually, Propaganda and Counterterrorism Strategies for Global Change. I took another 3 years building more evidence before I published the book. And in the meantime worked on another project, Bad News for Refugees, which looked at how refugees were misrepresented in the British media and the sort of very, very negative framing of migrant populations in the UK, in the right-wing press, and also mainstream kind of broadcast media and so on. So that book was co-authored with my former PhD supervisor, Greg Philo. What's Wrong with the Democrats is my book that I'm currently working on. So the Propaganda and Counterterrorism project, that was a really kind of incredible experience, because for me, coming from like working class background in the UK, like I wasn't born into a family with loads of connections in these sorts of circles or anything like that, and I wasn't going to a school which has those kinds of connections. Like if I'd gone to Cambridge, it probably would have been a bit easier to get those kinds of intelligence ties and things like that. So starting out, I mean, I remember my first presentation at like as a new PhD student, talking about the type of research I wanted to do, and everybody was like, "You're never going to get access. Why would they ever talk to you?" You know, looking at me as like a young female as well. You know, these military guys are not going to want to talk to you about all of this stuff. It turned out like it was, I think, a little bit easier because in some senses they underestimated me, you know, and I think also, you know, the outreach to academia is a little bit different to the way that they would maybe communicate to journalists. So as a training sociologist, I think actually a lot of the military are quite interested in courting these kinds of people in a way, or at least spinning them a line that they want to particularly have in your book. So the first interview I remember I did was not terribly forthcoming. They were, you know, very much sticking to the talking points, and I was a little bit disappointed. I was like, oh, this isn't going well. But that guy actually was really, really helpful because he then introduced me to other people, and once you talk to one person, then other people were much more forthcoming, and also they're wondering what the other folks said about them, you know, so you can kind of use that to navigate. And you know, I really very quickly had to learn to talk the talk as well in relation to, you know, counterterrorism, and understand the way that they perceive things in order to understand how to word my questions as well. Some of the people that I was interested in speaking to through that were also contractors. So I spoke to people from the White House all the way down to people in Afghanistan and Iraq working for the Pentagon, as well as a State Department and so on, and the British equivalents, CIA. So all these kinds of people, but also I was really interested in talking to contractors. And I spoke to a number of different contractors, not just SCL. But SCL were probably one of the earliest that I did interviews with. So that was during my my master's degree, actually, which started looking at similar things. I was doing a presentation as part of a NATO conference. I was invited to come and speak at a NATO counterterrorism conference, and I was like, well, that's an opportunity to sort of get some more interviews with people. So I went and I did a very scary talk with all of these kind of military people in front of me. It was quite terrifying as a young student. Anyway, the results of that was I got my first interview with somebody at SCL, and I, you know, managed to get increasing amounts of access to the particular company, and some of these people I've known for over 10 years. And when it came to sort of 2016, I was very interested in, well, you know, it's very difficult to challenge these systems. How do you challenge these systems? You have to go to the realm of politics, okay? In order to rethink the problems in our society, you have to challenge policy. So I was interested in policy debates, and that's where the book, What's Wrong with the Democrats? Media Bias, Inequality, and the Rise of Donald Trump came from. And I was already going to write about the Democrats, inequality, these kinds of issues. And then, you know, really the elections just seem to be proving our points entirely, unfortunately, about the Democratic Party and its failure to reach out to ordinary Americans with across very important issues. So, and I found out that, you know, not only had Cambridge Analytica, some sort of, you know, partner organization, if you like, of SCL, not only had they worked for Trump, but they'd also worked for Brexit. And, you know, the powerful impact that the Brexit vote had on me in the UK, especially having written Bad News for Refugees a few years earlier, you know, it bowled me over. I mean, I was a little complacent, I guess. I thought, you know, there's no way this could happen. And so then when it came to the American election, I was spending a whole year over here at George Washington University working on this book, 2016 to 2017. And I was saying to people at the end, like before they vote, like, this could well happen. Don't get complacent. We've just gone through this, and the opportunity to really research this in great depth, kind of like, I couldn't not, go and try and contact these people, get these interviews. So I started to really sort of dig, particularly when I realized, this is a company that has, come out of defense. And what they're doing is they're creating massive divisions, not just in my society, but now in America. And so I was researching all of these kinds of topics, which I see as unfortunately related. I mean, in some senses, I thought they were separate projects when I first started out. Interestingly, I was also researching Russia. But anyway, it all seemed to sort of end up in one big project, in a sense. The book that we've been writing with Robert Entman was an analysis of the media debate during the elections, not just in 2016, but the lead up from that, and problems with the Democrats' political communication, elitism, things like that. We've done a little bit of audience research, and I've done so far 18 interviews from the Democratic campaign. And also then, of course, did the Cambridge Analytica interviews.
So what do you mean by quantitative content analysis?
Well, we're looking across many different media forms and doing an analysis using QDA minor of the language that's used by Republicans and Democrats, and framing, media bias, things like that. So essentially our argument is that it's not a liberal media bias, that it is a, some might call neoliberal, but free market bias, and that there are different different sort of slants, if you like, across different policy areas. So you can't say overall there is a liberal bias. So that's another argument in the book, but I don't want to stay too much on that today because of the fact that it's supposed to be talking about the Cambridge Analytica. So just as a little bit of background, there was a realignment of the political elites in America during this period of, over a longish period, but especially leading up to 2016, and with the rise of the Mercers, as I'm sure you've seen in the media. Now, Steve Bannon was their sort of their key individual that they sought to work with to reshape policy, I would argue, on quite a large scale. And he was the vice president of Cambridge Analytica. He had a lot of different, media enterprises that he had at his disposal during this period. Huge amounts of money being channeled through this, these new infrastructure and new networks that were being established in order to carry these kinds of messages. And Cambridge Analytica was a key part of this. So this is a little bit of a representation from Benkler et al. Of the kind of infrastructure and how it appeared in Twitter and in Facebook. So you can see here, this is the mainstream media, and it's blue, so it's mostly Democrats who are tweeting. This is Twitter, that's Facebook. So this is what the kinds of media that they were consuming. This says New York Times, that says CNN, I don't know if you can see, okay, that's the Washington Post. This is the very radical right-wing media. This is, I think, Breitbart. I can't see it because I'm too close.
What's the green one?
These they thought were down the middle. They're independents and things like that. So essentially this, I would argue, represents the mainstream, the far right infrastructure that has developed since 2008, roughly, 2010. And there isn't really a left-wing version. There are bits and pieces of things I would say are quite left-wing, scattered around here, but they aren't a nexus like that in themselves. And that seems to be the same with both of these social media forms anyway. Now, of course, like the Cambridge Analytica were also very, were drawing on tropes which were, you know, already established long before this election. But one of the interesting things is they actually did an awful lot of research to come up with these kinds of messages. So, for instance, one of the things they did was they went to ordinary Americans' homes, talked to them, listened to them, and made notes of what they were actually saying. Now, this is something like the Democratic Party do huge amounts of polls and things like that. However, they don't really go to people's houses, listen to what they're saying, and come up with the same, repeat the same messages back to them. Regardless of whether it's like fake and you know, not necessarily backed up by science, this particular narrative, they realized that there were certain things that people say, and what you need to do in order to get them to respond to you is say those same things back to them. So Crooked Hillary, it kind of came out of that kind of research. And I think is really an important part of like undermining that kind of argument. So inequality is a big part of the book and our narrative. The you know, gap between the rich and the poor is an important underlying element of this kind of our book. Essentially, small government policies run counter to public's preferences. If you actually look at Grossman and Hopkins, what they found was what most Americans actually support mixed economy kind of policies. But if you actually ask them about their ideology, then most of them would say that they are conservative, or, you know, but they actually support kind of more liberal policies. Hacker and Pearson also have argued that America has forgotten what made it great. So the free market damages economic interest and emotional well-being for most Americans. Democrats are failing to get this across. That's our argument. Also, there is like a this kind of idea that there is social mobility in America is a myth, increasingly so. So here is America in relation to different countries around the world, doing very, very badly at, you know, equality of opportunity and so forth. The American dream no longer functions as it used to. So you have a really extreme inequality, which of course is also racialized. And it's, you know, you have the Democratic Party being framed as an elite, partly because they're not listening to people, genuinely. There are real conflicts of interest there. And so what was the answer to this? Then this kind of coverage. We've seen all of this. You are very familiar with Build the Wall and so forth. But this is where I would argue Cambridge Analytica played such an important role. It's in the creation of artificial enemies, othering. The way that Trump's strategy was deployed, this was crucial, I believe. There is very little we can do to measure the relative influence between Russia, between, you know, Cambridge Analytica, between Hillary Clinton's flawed ability to get her message across, you know, what lost the election for them or won the election for Trump is a very, very complex thing that nobody is going to be able to quantify for you. However, I do think that the types of strategies that they deployed are so unique. You know, we haven't seen an election like this, and there's a reason for that. So, a little bit about SCL Group, because you haven't probably heard as much about SCL, and before I present some of the interviews that I've done, I want to introduce some of the characters. So this is Nigel Oakes. He is the CEO of SCL Group. and related to a bunch of the companies that are part of the group. This is a really excellent diagram, but it probably is very minimal. There are much more of different companies that are related to this group, many of whom we don't know about yet, which are, some of them are coming out. But you can see down here, Cambridge Analytica. There's also SCL USA and various other American affiliates. This is the original, which was a defense contractor. There's also the Behavioral Dynamics Institute, which I'll mention. That's their research core. So this was something set up by Nigel Oakes in order to sort of provide them with what they argued to be, you know, something extra special. This is their special sauce that they are selling when they are trying to get contracts. And it is essentially, they pull in a load of academics. They did research with DARPA and other sort of military and intelligence research units and so on, working with the British government as well. And that kind of research core, their methodology, was then drawn on by all of these kinds of companies. They all have access to this research core. And essentially it was developed during the first sort of 10, many more years of the company when they were just a defense contractor. And it's been built on since then, of course, but all of these kinds of methodologies have been building on this kind of understanding and knowledge and techniques that Nigel Oakes helped to develop at the Behavioral Dynamics Institute. So that's very significant, and you'll see why in a minute. Now, a lot of people have been pointing to the fact that these might be considered to be weaponization of our political systems. I think there are distinct parallels between these kinds of methodologies, and I think it's deeply significant that this kind of very divisive messaging was used. This kind of the way that extremism was driven up. When I realized that this was this same group of companies that were working on elections, it made me very disturbed, because the Behavioral Dynamics, Institute have developed their knowledge from interviewing extremists, and I think that's you can't ignore that. So the type of, they really understand extremism. They knew what they were doing. So what I want to do is play you a few audio clips. So last Monday, my evidence to the fake news inquiry of the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Committee in the UK Parliament was published. I also submitted to two other inquiries. So the Electoral Commission, who are dealing with possible illegalities or questions of law in relation to Brexit, and also the ICO, who deal with the sort of information and data side of things. So the stuff that the fake news inquiry published included Andy Wigmore, who was the director of the Leave.eu campaign, which was the very sort of right, not just right wing, but like anti-immigration wing of the Leave campaign. So it was not the official designated campaign, but it was another campaign which was sort of the face of this was Nigel Farage, really, and my evidence in relation to that sort of shows that they drew on the methodology of Cambridge Analytica, even though they weren't employed by them. So they couldn't be employed by them because for various different reasons. But essentially that could raise questions in relation to the coordination of different campaigns if they had been employed by them. However, the fact that they used the methodology that had been presented to them, you know, it could be argued that it might have been a gift in kind. So I interviewed him, and that was published. There was also Nigel Oakes, who I've just mentioned, Sam Patton, and Jerry Gunster, who also worked on the Leave.eu campaign. I'm going to play you a few little clips. So I think one of the most important for me to play you, I want to start with the clip about Muslims and immigrants, because I think that it sits an important, you'll understand afterwards why I've played this, but I think it's important that you understand what knowledge they have.
Resonance with American audiences.
Now you picked the absolutely right word there, because when we explain in the 2-minute lift pitch what happened with Trump, you can forget all the micro-targeting, micro-data, whatever, and come back to some very, very simple things, which is Trump had the balls, I mean really the balls, to say what people wanted to hear. And we all thought it was a joke every time he said it. Every time he said we're going to put up a wall for the Mexicans, and we're going, you can't say that. You know, it's loony. And then we're going to get the Mexicans to pay for it. And the Mexican president was going, I'm not bloody paying for any of this. But it didn't matter, because in the Ross states, the guys were saying, look, I've got people, Mexicans coming across illegally, not paying any tax, taking all our healthcare, taking our jobs, and putting the price down of things anyway, and I'm bloody sick of it. And so if a man comes up and says, you know, it's, you know, he didn't say we're going to redress he said we're going to build a wall and kick these fuckers out. And to a lot of people, that really resonated. He also said ridiculous things like, you know, we're going to ban Muslims from coming into the country because I'm sick of people taking machine guns and pointing them at schools and our children are the most important thing. Well, there's never been a Muslim ever that's put a gun on an American school. But it seems to...
But the perception is there that they could
that's terrorism, and it must be Muslims, and there have been a lot of shootings. They're all Americans who do the shootings. And people go, yeah, fuck it, it's our children. We don't want that. So, and you get Hillary Clinton going, we're going to increase the fiduciary, financial spending, and 4% growth in our area. And people going, well, you know, good luck with that. I want to build a wall. I've got a wall in my garden. It keeps out the badgers, you know. I understand the wall.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I don't think you have badges here, but I'm sure you get the point. So,
Not
you
as
know,
big as yours.
yes, absolutely. So you can see from that, you know, he knew that it was a fake argument. That, you know, they knew this is cynical deployment of the other, essentially. Now, the Select Committee also chose to publish some of the content that I'd submitted, which included off-the-record segments. Only a couple, however, they are out there, they're now in the public domain. They are also under parliamentary privilege, and, you know, so I'm going to play this now. So, yes, essentially, I mean, he's saying Trump had the balls to lie. And I think that's deeply significant. Okay, then...
There's also, you know, I mean, it didn't matter.
I'm sorry if this is...
What he was saying, it didn't matter if he's alienating. Actually, and I think, you know, they were
that okay?
never going to get them anyway. And you've got to think about what would resonate, you know, with as many as possible.
And often, as you rightly say, is that the things that resonate, someone to attack the other group and know that you're going to lose them is going to reinforce and resonate your group, which is why, you know, Hitler, be very careful about saying this, wasn't ever public say this off the record, but of course Hitler attacked the Jews because he didn't have a problem with the Jews at all. But the people didn't like the Jews, and so if the people saw, he could just use them to say, so he just leveraged an artificial enemy. Well, this is exactly what Trump did. He leveraged a Muslim. You know, it was a real enemy. ISIS is how big a threat is ISIS really to America? You know, really. I mean, we're still talking about 9/11. 9/11 is a long time ago.
The significance of this as well, okay, there is much in this that is deeply significant. You know, Hitler didn't have a problem with the Jews? Are you kidding me? You know, not to mention, you know, his comments about Trump and artificial enemies, obviously deeply significant. But also, like, this is somebody who has built their entire company off the back of the war on terror. This is how they've expanded into, you know, this is how their methodology was developed. This is how, you know, it's hugely important that he's saying, like, this isn't even a threat. I will come back to playing another clip, but I just want to, where is that? Okay. 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 So the reason I'm talking about Nigel Oakes and SCL is also because these companies basically have been they've been saying that these companies are very, very separate and are not, you know, related to each other. Now, I think this, you know, there definitely was an effort latterly to separate the companies and make them look more separate, so that the defense contractor didn't look like it's in any way, shape or form related to the stuff going on in elections and so on. There was pressure from democratic governments contracting to them, and also, like, it really, you know, it's about the survival of the companies, because it doesn't look too good if they are looking like they aren't separate companies. Also, siloing, you know, many of you will have probably seen that, you know, clip of Alexander Nix, where he was talking about hiring prostitutes, and which the Channel 4 news kind of described as possible entrapment and so on in relation to, you know, elections in an international context. Now, though people involved in those kinds of activities, you know, you don't tell everyone, you know. You want it as siloed off as possible. So there were people who perhaps knew about these things, but there were other people in those companies that perhaps didn't know about what was going on. And, you know, it's a little bit about managing dissent, I think, in sort of separating the companies off. However, different parts of the evidence that have been presented seem to imply that there are staffing overlaps, particularly in relation to Nigel Oakes, which I'm going to come back to, also financial relationships and so on. Nigel Oakes, in my interview with him, also referred to what we were doing in the war on terror, in the clip that you just heard. What we were doing in the election, the American election. Now, he is not Cambridge Analytica, and if they're saying those are separate companies, why are we doing it? That brings me to Sam Patton, and I think it's really important you actually see this video. How am I doing time-wise? Am I okay?
Yeah.
Good. Good.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but this has been referred to as the murder video. Essentially, in the Nigerian election, well, you'll see. But this, I'm not going to play anything graphic. Don't worry. But this was the Guardian have said that this, and actually. Chris Wiley in his evidence talked about this as a video that was produced by Cambridge Analytica or distributed as well, I think, with AIQ. They've been questioned about it in their testimony recently in Canada. Essentially, this was created for deployment in the Nigerian election in order to terrify voters. It includes sort of footage of dismemberment and people being burned alive and so on, and from actual historical footage, so real footage. So okay, I'm not going to play the whole thing because it does get graphic, but
very uncertain. Sharia for all.
The videos included content where people were being dismembered, where people were having their throats cut and bled to death in a ditch. They were being burned alive. There's incredibly anti-Islamic and threatening messages portraying Muslims as violent.
What would Nigeria look like if Sharia were imposed as Buhari is committed to do? We can assume Buhari will punish all who speak against Israel.
okay, I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's not so pleasant, but you can look at that yourself if you wish to. However, I did include in my hang on a sec, how do I make this big again? In my evidence, some of my interview with Sam Patton, who was the person who was the chief strategist on that particular campaign. He also worked in the American predecessor to the psychographic deployment of their methodology in for crews. So there were other sort of trial runs of this kind of methodology in the States, and he worked in Oregon on that messaging, sorry, not this messaging, but on the US messaging for the campaigns in Oregon. The same person who did this.
Who was he working for in Oregon?
Sorry?
Who was he working for?
SCL. Well,
No, for what?
What
campaign?
candidate?
What candidate?
I can't say. I'm sorry.
You mean you know but can't say?
I can't say.
Okay.
I can't stray too far beyond my evidence that I've submitted for legal reasons. So I apologize if I can't answer everything at the moment.
Can you say anything about the Oregon campaign?
I can't really. Sorry. There may be more to come though. Okay, so he said, so this is about a different campaign again. So he told me about being approached by SCL, and I think this really sort of gives a sense of how they are seen or were seen, and you know, their reputation in Washington. So this is somebody who's quite a Washington insider, I would say, on the Republican right. When they contacted me, they said they had a short fuse sort of thing in Kosovo, and they didn't really get into details. They said, could we be ready one day if this happens? I said yes, without even, I assumed it was the dirty bad guys, the mafia guys, you know, the gangsters. Because it was SCL, he assumes it's the bad guys. It actually turned out it wasn't the bad guys. But that's the assumption, is that if you're working for SCL, it's going to be the bad guys. He also said, I've worked for Ukraine, Iraq, I've worked in deeply corrupt countries, and our system, it isn't very different about the United States. So Oakes' responsibility, I would say this is a really important passage from my evidence. He said, So this is where, actually, I can play you the audio of that too. Let me do that. It's much better if you can hear it yourself. So essentially, he tells me that how crucial he is, and his research unit, BDI, which I mentioned, how important that was to what Cambridge Analytica were able to do.
Well, internally in a company, that's a different thing. But the actual corporate entities, you know, I mean, Alexander will call me in. I'm going in this afternoon. But in fact, you know, it's our conversations apart, Trump, apart. You know, we all work together. But you know, I would never ever say what we do. We'd never touch politics. I mean, I have in the past because we were. You know, I set up the company. But now I'm totally defence. I've got to be totally defence. And I've got to be very, you know, because you know,
Can I ask you about how, because I think the perception anyway is that the companies have been sort of rebalanced towards politics by,
yes.
and maybe by, towards commercial, by the weight of the money, essentially.
Yes, this is where Alexander Nix has been very clever.
Okay.
And genuinely clever. I'm not, you know, he's turned it into a very successful commercial entity. Whereas, and he would say exactly the same about me. He'd say, I'm too academic and too, you know, and the analogy on a tiny, not arrogant scale is that if he's the Steve Jobs, I'm the Steve Wozniak, you know, I'm the sort of the guy who wants to get the engineering right, and he's the guy who wants to sell the flashy bombs. And he's very good at it, and I admire him enormously for doing it. But I'm the guy who says, like, yeah, but without this, you couldn't do any of that.
Yeah. So essentially, that core, which was developed through defence, and you know, this long legacy of research from SCL. I mean, Cambridge Analytica only became a company in around 2012, 2013. You know, and yes, they developed new methodology. So don't get me wrong. This isn't just like they took this and deployed it. Like, and you know, with an American media, like any campaign that you do is always going to be different depending on the context, because you have different media, different people, you know, so you have to develop methods for a particular place. However, it was drawing on that. I mean, that's what he said to me, and so I only have what I learned from my research to go on, and that seemed pretty clear to me. And he's essentially saying how responsible he is. Not only did he set up the company, he said, but also like the methods that are at its heart are developed by him and his unit. So, also, you know, I mean, he talks as well about how nervous the governments essentially had been, and why these companies became separated. So, like you heard, he said, we've all worked for other people, we all have, eternally, that's the, but the corporate entities, I mean, you know, there's strong lines between the different companies because the defense people can't be seen to be getting involved in politics. The State Department, they get very upset. So they've had to separate this. But one of the most important things I would say is like, well, if they had to separate, and if the State Department was saying, you know, we're not too sure about this, keep these apart, then they must have known there was a reason to separate. They must have known that something was going on that they'd found unsavory. So I think that's one of the most important things is like, what did our governments know about what was going on? They monitor elections around the world, things like that. So I think there is also responsibility there. Okay. Also, you know, okay, so Breitbart, we all know that Steve Bannon was also in charge of Breitbart. We've done some early survey data as part of our book as well, looking at trust in relation to that. It was quite concerning, I'll be honest. This is trustworthy. 35% of Republicans felt that Breitbart was trustworthy. 20% of Democrats? And we did give them an option for don't know if they weren't sure what Breitbart was. This is I haven't got the number, I'm sorry, I prepared a little bit in a hurry of the number of people we sent, we polled on this, we surveyed. However, it was a structured sample done in a way that it should be representative of the US population.
How long ago was it for?
About 6 months ago, not that long ago. These are early findings, I apologize, but I thought I should shove those in because it's kind of important here. There are many questions that are raised by this. How am I doing time-wise? Okay.
If you want to do good Q&A, I would suggest ending soon.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Essentially, my argument is that, you know, there has to be some interrogation of the concept that the SCL Group has responsibility, not just Cambridge Analytica. And in particular, Nigel Oakes, based off the evidence that I've just presented on, which I submitted to the inquiry. Also, I think we need to consider the possibility of, you know, what our governments knew. They maybe need to at least answer the question of why they, you know, had not done more to stop this happening. And in particular, it raises questions about contracting and how government contracts are overseen. The legacy of research that was done with DARPA, for instance, you know, are they not watching what then happens to those tools? How they then get used in other contexts? Are they not responsible in any way for those kinds of tools developed with BDI being deployed in elections, potentially? You know, I mean, I don't know, it raises very, very many questions, and it's very, very disturbing. Also, I think there are questions about academia, because a lot of, in relation to propaganda research, a lot of what has been done has been focused on public diplomacy, getting America's message across, and focusing on those kinds of State Department tools that are easy to ask about and easy to access and easy to research, and people not asking the questions about what really matters that goes on underneath. This is, you know, not the only example ever of people acting unethically in this field, but I think a lot of the research that goes on, it's all functional. It's about, you know, how do we communicate more effectively, not like, you know, what's going on in terms of the like deep, you know, wider sort of significance of our broken international system, as far as I'm concerned. You know, this is stuff that's deeply, deeply important. What about our ethics, you know? A lot of the, you know, discussion about soft power, it's all about like Russian propaganda and so on, and there's no acknowledgement of what impact we're having on other nations, and if companies, you know, profit-making companies are deploying these same tools elsewhere around the world, that's destabilizing. What about that video in Nigeria? Like, that's what is that? We're going to have to deploy our defense in that country in the future too, and they're going to make money out of it. Why, you know, how are we not interrogating this system? It's, sorry, I'm getting quite passionate now, but it upset me greatly, this project. Anyway, thank you so much, everyone. I look forward to your questions, and feel free to check out my website and follow me.